Warm welcome to everybody. My name is Timo Halttunen and I'm from University of Turku, Finland, and I'm the moderator for the third week of UCEN ULLL Open Fora this year. And today we start with Michaela MARTIN from UNESCO. But before that, we can have a very short look on the whole week, that what is our week going to look like. And let me quickly share the screen. So we start with today. The topic is flexible pathways in higher education. Then tomorrow, our topic is a holistic management framework for the university lifelong learning and university business collaboration as a base for success. Then Wednesday, we are having a look at developing a framework for sustainable growth of flexible learning opportunities. Thursday, we are having a look at university lecturers and staff development in a post-pandemic world. And then on Friday, we have the panel of making flexibility in higher education a reality and what is the role of university lifelong learning. And here, as you saw, I had some really old pictures to, in a way, remind that we have also done a lot of progress in higher education. So things are not like that you saw in the pictures from the 1960s, but still there's of course things to do. But without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, so Michaela MARTIN, and I'll share quickly again something about your profile here. So Michaela comes from International Institute for Educational Planning at UNESCO, and she's in charge of the organization's current research on flexible learning pathways in higher education. And when I asked my speakers for this week that what are the topics of interest, so Michaela said higher education management and governance, quality assurance, and flexible learning pathways. And then furthermore, what is her understanding of flexibility in higher education? And Michaela said, learning and teaching is increasingly freed from the limitations of the time, place, and pace of study. So with these perspectives in mind, I leave the floor to Michaela. Welcome. And first, you will give a presentation, and then we'll have an ample time for discussion and debating on this topic. So please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Timo. First of all, for this very kind invitation to this forum. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for professional exchange and learning, flexible learning. So I'm very happy to be with you today. So I am working at the International Institute for Educational Planning, UNESCO Institute. Our main objective is to support UNESCO member states in the planning and management of their education systems. And we have a long-standing research and training program on higher education, mainly focused so far in the area of higher education governance. We have been working 50 years on higher education governance, sometimes at the level of higher education institutions, sometimes at the level of higher education systems. And our last research has been focusing on planning for flexible learning pathways in higher education. And that is again a topic I think that requires a two-level approach, because on the one hand, I think you need good policies But what you even need more is good implementation and sometimes also initiative taking at the level of higher education institutions. Yeah, and so I think that makes the topic also particularly relevant. Can you move the slide? So what I would like to do today is to provide some context on this research project, and then to dwell a little bit into 3 dimensions that we have studied on our research: diverse entry pathways, technology, flexible progression. You see at the top it says 4 dimensions. There were 4, but I decided to cut the presentation. There was also a dimension on governance, but I thought I should leave more time for discussion with you. And then I will present some main issue points. Can we move the slide? So some words about the context of this research. The rationale behind our research was actually the rapid expansion of student enrollments in higher education and the diversification of providers. So there are very diversified higher education systems today, public, private, college, university, cross-border providers. And so higher education systems have become increasingly complex, and therefore it's difficult for students to navigate across higher education systems as the higher education sector is increasingly fragmented. And also in higher education systems, we are quite a high share of young people are studying. We have also a more diverse student body, a growing number of first-generation students. We have a lot of adult learners coming back and returnees to higher education. And then in addition to this, we are facing an unprecedented sanitary crisis with more than 220 million of students being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we could see in our research, the research was started actually before the pandemic started. We started our research in 2019. But we could see also how helpful some of the findings were actually to inform policies that I think many of which will be taken once the crisis is over, and we hope so that it will be soon. Can we move to the next slide? So before I will present the findings of our research, I would like to consider what flexible learning means and how we can define it. So flexible learning, and that's what I have already communicated to Timo, is, in my opinion, it's learning that is free from constraints of time, place, and pace, and where the learner can choose entry and exit points, learning activities, assessment modes, and educational resources. So a learner can then choose how, where, when, and what of learning through different means: technology-enhanced learning, flexible pedagogical approaches, flexible institutional structure, and more. And in our research, we have also used a definition that has been provided by UNESCO, which defines flexible learning pathways as entry and re-entry points at all ages and all educational levels, strengthened links between formal and non-formal structures, and recognition, validation, and accreditation of the knowledge, skills, and competencies acquired through non-formal and informal education. So you can see that this definition, UNESCO's definition, puts a heavy emphasis actually on the recognition and certification of knowledge. Can we move the slide? So let me provide you with some background on our research. So we have gone through a 3-stage process. On the one hand, so in the first place, we started with a stock-taking exercise. So we looked in the literature, we consulted with quite a number of experts in the area to identify promising practices. And then this stock-taking exercise has informed the development and of an international survey. that we conducted among UNESCO member states to get a full picture actually on existing policies, implementation bottlenecks, and also good practices that ministries could share with us. And then we went into the third stage, an 8-country case study, in-depth case study research. So we worked with research teams from Chile, Finland, India, Jamaica, Malaysia, Morocco, South Africa, and the UK. So you can see also that it is a cross-continent sample of countries. And these are all countries that had explicit policies on flexible learning pathways. And if I say explicit policies, it was not necessarily a policy on flexible learning pathways, but there were strong policies with respect to alternative entry, flexible progression, and flexible mode of delivery in these countries that we wanted to study. And we wanted to study also more particularly how these national policies impacted on the realities in higher education institutions. So the approach that we have taken to the issue of flexible learning pathways is really flexible learning pathways that allow students to, through multiple articulated pathways, to obtain a qualification. And so we have looked into 3 stages, and you can see that these stages mark the student's progression through a higher education sector, so pathways for getting into higher education, such as alternative admission policies, equitable admission policies and practices, pathways for getting through higher education, study transfer, credit accumulation and transfer, flexible delivery mode, and pathways for getting out of higher education, completion and transition to the labor market, with opportunities to combine work and study, flexible degree structures, and continuous learning as well. Can we move the slide? So let me dwell into the first dimension, international perspectives on diverse and flexible entry pathways. So here's a piece, and we can you move the slide? You have to move now 2 slides. Okay, and the next one. Okay, so here is some data from our international survey on diverse entry pathways into higher education. So we sent our survey to the 193 member states of UNESCO, and we got 76 exploitable country resources. If you take into account that quite a number of UNESCO member states are really small countries and have very small higher education sectors, I think that we were able to gain data from about half of all UNESCO member states. And here in a nutshell, what we have learned that in many countries, short cycle qualifications programs on the ISCED, so International Standard Classification of Education Development, level 5, this is 2 years after the upper secondary education, for instance, offered in vocational college. Such ISCED level 5 education allowed for more permeability and diverse entry pathways than academic bachelor level programs. And by contrast, bachelor level programs, ISCED level 6, were less permeable, with the most common entry path being a general secondary leaving certificate, or sometimes a vocational secondary leaving certificate. And what we could also see in the data is that in most of the surveyed countries, policies existed to support recognition of prior learning, but that recognition of prior learning practices based on non-formal and informal learning were much less common. So recognition of prior learning, when it exists, it focuses much more commonly on formal learning. Can we move to the next slide? Preparatory programs. So preparatory programs are usually created to provide a link between upper secondary levels, upper secondary school level and higher education. And they typically support learners to meet general entry requirements when they can be expected to face difficulties when entering an academically oriented higher education program. This can be the case when they come to higher education with a TVET background, or when they come from disadvantaged schools. The programs are oriented on enabling learners to gain broader skills and knowledge prioritized in the academic setting and in conventional admission. There can be preparatory courses between upper secondary level and higher education institutions, or preparatory courses can be provided by higher education institutions themselves at the first year of entry. So two good examples, one from Chile and the other one from the UK. So in Chile, selected universities and upper secondary schools participate in the Program for Effective Access and Support, the PACE program, to ensure the transition of disadvantaged students into higher education. So high-performing students from lower socioeconomic background receive supplementary classes organized in evenings or weekends during the last 2 years of upper secondary school to prepare them for access to higher education by emphasizing academic skills needed for students to cope in higher education. So students also receive mentoring and guidance during their first year of university to prevent dropout and support student learning. And in the UK, there exists a foundational degree since already 2001, and it is organized between further education colleges and universities. And foundation degrees allow learners to enter who have no generally set entry conditions. So commercial or industrial experiences may be important in gaining a place, when formal maybe as important as formal qualifications, and practical experience is always taken into account. So a student can obtain a bachelor degree by spending 2 years in a further education college and then move for the final year of the bachelor's degree to the university. This pathway supports those students who otherwise would not meet the general entry requirements in universities. So can we move the slide? Yeah, some words about recognition of prior learning. So recognition of prior learning clearly supports flexibility and access. Our UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in Hamburg defines RPL as acknowledging knowledge and skills obtained in formal, non-formal, and informal contexts. And several of our case countries have strong national systems for facilitating recognition of prior learning. For instance, South Africa and Malaysia. While in others, initiatives for recognition of prior learning tend to be either an institutional responsibility or they are delegated to external accreditation and validation agencies, like in the UK and Malaysia. In Malaysia, one of our case countries, there exists a national system called Accreditation of Prior Experiential Learning, APEL, and it has been created for access and both for access and credit transfer of learning gains in informal and non-formal settings. And more recently, APEL is also providing access to the award of academic qualifications. What is interesting to know is that its implementation is supported with guidelines from the Malaysian Qualification Agency and is carried out through designated APEL centers across the country that are authorized to conduct the recognition of prior learning and do the procedure and testing. And it's interesting that these centers are located in as well also in rural areas, so to provide actually accessibility of these centers to potential learners. So while there are countries which have an advanced use of recognition of prior learning, we observed that recognition of prior learning is not a mainstream entry pathway into higher education in most countries. It's more often practiced by vocational institutions for recognition of labor competencies rather than academic institutions. Can we move to the next slide? So the next slide is about open entry. And open entry has been identified as a popular route in many of the case countries. We could see this, for instance, in Finland, Chile, Malaysia, India, UK, and Morocco. So open entry is meant for continuous learning, reskilling and upskilling, but sometimes also to offer learning opportunities to students who could not access higher education. Open entry allows learners to take part in higher education without meeting traditional entry requirements, for instance, through their participation in selected university courses or even MOOCs. When credit gained through open studies, while credits gained through open studies may also be recognized, typically this pathway does not lead to a formal degree. However, several higher education institutions have begun offering digital credentials, micro-credential, for instance, or opportunities to recognize a certain share of open entry credits when a student enrolls in a formal degree program. So Finland is an example. It has created an interesting policy initiative, the so-called open studies. So some Finnish universities provide access to both those who could not get a study place after secondary schooling, because the system is quite selective, but also returning adults. Classes are open to anyone and do not require entrance examination. Open studies have the same content and requirements as traditional programs in public higher education institutions, but they do not lead to a qualification. However, a certain share of credits, which is decided independently by each higher education institution, can be recognized towards a degree when a student enrolls in a degree program at the same higher education institution where open studies have been pursued. Let us move on to the next slide. So we have also looked into technology-enhanced learning. And here is some data from our international survey. So even before the pandemic, in our international survey, we asked ministries of higher education of UNESCO member states what modes of delivery of higher education they widely use in their higher education systems. And most of the responding countries, 78%, mentioned that they had been offering already distance online education prior to COVID-19. Also, the quality and validation of such delivery modes was mentioned to be still a challenge in some countries. Countries combine typically face-to-face provision and elements of distance and online learning to better provide flexibility to a wide range of learners. And certainly, as we all know, the use of open online and distance learning through the pandemic has drastically increased. And in many education programs, it has become the only means of delivery learning during the pandemic. And of course, it now remains to be seen what type of practices we will persist. And many experts believe that blended learning is actually the future of higher education. Some words about open online and distance learning. So open online and distance learning, which heavily relies on the use of the internet, digital platforms and other tools, has a number of benefits for learners. It enables flexibility in terms of location of learning and pace of study. It therefore allows to expand access to education and enables continuous learning opportunities for reskilling and further study for diverse types of students. Open universities, usually these are single-mode institutions, usually facilitate full-time ODL programs, but they can also be facilitated by regular institutions, dual-mode institutions that provide face-to-face programs and ODL programs. A good practice that we would like to highlight comes from the UK. In 2012, the British Open Universities, which has specialized in ODL for many decades, has created the Future Learn platform in collaboration with 170 British and international universities. And it's the Future Learn platform is a MOOCs platform which provides short courses, online degrees, and micro-credentials. Future Learn has 30 million people who have signed up to it worldwide. It uses design, technology, and partnership to create flexible online courses as well as undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. And there are approximately 3,000 online courses available now on the Future Learn platform since it has been launched, with 620 short courses available in June 2020. But quality assurance of technology enhanced learning. So we move on to the next slide, I should have mentioned. Next one. Yeah, quality assurance of technology enhanced learning remains a challenge in many countries. ODL programs in many countries are still not recognized to the same level as traditional face-to-face ones, either officially for public sector employment and also sometimes more informally by the labor market. So there's an increasing move to develop quality assurance systems for technology enhanced learning. And we could see in among our case studies that several of the national quality assurance agencies had actually provided guidelines for ODL, MOOCs, and micro-credentials. And we saw that this was an interesting and quite supportive mechanism for higher education institutions. So we can move on to the next slide. So to provide international perspective on diverse progression and pathways. And here is some data on articulation processes. So from our international survey, we learned that opportunities for students to transfer or articulate across similar fields of study are overall more common than among the same field of study, than across different fields of studies. In systems that do apply cross-disciplinary transfer, they take place more frequently within the same institution than across institutions and are more commonly supported by national regulations and national transfer systems. So we move to the next slide. Transfer policies were found to facilitate flexible progression of learners most frequently. Transfers in the case countries are understood as a seamless transfer of students across programs, disciplines, and institutions. The study country have either national system of transfer or transfer based on agreement between higher education institutions and their programs. In Finland, there is a developed system of national transfer of students. The country has a highly competitive admission system, I mentioned that already, in which both first-time and second-time applicants compete. So the transfer is organized to lift the pressure from the admission system so that students who are already in the system and who do not have to reapply again if they are not satisfied with the higher education place that was allocated to them when they started the study. Can we move to the next slide? Some words about credit accumulation and transfer. So credit accumulation and transfer system are an essential tool for implementing both transfer and RPL, recognition of prior learning processes, at the institutional level. RPL can support recognition and transfer of learning obtained in formal, informal, and non-formal settings. In the case countries, credit transfer supports the transfer of students from one program to the other and across institutions. Credit transfer across the study countries takes place at the national or institutional level. However, it's important to note also that there are often limitations on how many credits can be transferred across higher education institutions or their study programs. So there are limitations, even if the credit transfer system exists. It can be sometimes limited to 10 or 20% of credits obtained earlier that can be accumulated to transfer in another course. Also, often a match between content and learning outcomes can be required. And this is sometimes a cumbersome process. And so as a consequence, many higher education institutions refrain actually to get engaged in credit transfer from other higher education institutions. Related to this is also a constraint with funding, as in many systems, funding is provided for students in a full year. It can be constraining actually to move to a system where a student will be funded only on a partial share of the yearly allocation for his or her study place. So flexibility in the pace of study means that students can choose to combine their studies and work. It is normally facilitated through part-time, evening, weekend, holiday season, or other type of provision as opposed to full-time day study. In the UK, part-time provision is well developed throughout the post-secondary sector, with 24% of students studying part-time and completing a bachelor degree in 4 to 6 years. But the UK has also, over the past 4 or 5 years, seen a major drop in the participation of part-time students, which was due to the increase of the student fees. So part-time students have to pay the full tuition fees, and as a consequence, there has been a harsh drop in the participation of part-time students in UK higher education. In Chile as well, in 2020, 23% of students were enrolled in full-time evening studies, while some 70% were enrolled in traditional learning mode, and the remaining in online and distance education. So the evening studies pathways was preferred by adults, learners, and learners with caring responsibilities. So we can see that many countries have really a big share of part-time or evening students in the system, like in these 2 countries, close to a fourth of all students. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, flexibility in the curriculum. Flexibility in the organization of the curriculum can also ensure that learning suits students' needs and pathways. It is usually organized at the level of individual institutions via elective courses, cross-institutional departmental exchanges, or joint programs, joint degrees. Interesting to see, for instance, what we have seen in Finland as well, is that students can take modules that are organized in other higher education institutions if they find that these particular contents suits best their individual study progression. India has the choice-based credit system, which was introduced in 2015 to promote more interdisciplinary approaches and offer more flexibility in course choices. The University Grants Commission, which is the buffer organization of Indian universities, has published guidelines for the implementation of the system in central, state, and deemed universities. In the UK, they have seen at one of the case institutions, the University of Birmingham, and I should say also here that while we were studying national case studies, within each of the national case studies, the research teams have focused in on 2 to 3 diverse higher education institutions to really look at what is happening at the level of these institutions. So the University of Birmingham was a case study of the UK case study. So in Birmingham has created a 4-year degree, which is called the Bachelor in Liberal Arts and Natural Science, called LANS, to provide flexibility in the curriculum with interdisciplinary combinations and a year abroad. The responsibility of the curriculum content is transferred to the student, who can tailor it to their needs and interests by choosing modules across the university according to their major or joint major. Yeah, and I want to, coming now more or less to the end, I want to say some words about information and guidance for flexible progression. And I think it's a particularly important aspect because the more choice there is in a higher education system, the more it is important to provide students actually with guidance to make informed choices. Number one, on what is available to them and what type of flexible pathways are available, but also what suits them and their career perspective or career outlook. So the findings from our international survey suggest that information and guidance services are delivered most commonly at the level of higher education institutions rather than at the system level. And some systems actually have national platforms that provide an overview over the higher education offer, but then complemented also with more institutional based guidance on what is available at the level of higher education institutions, and to provide also support to building up a vision for a student's career choice or career perspective. So overall, 57 countries indicated that such services are provided in-house at the level of higher education institutions generally through guidance and counseling offices or similar entities. In some cases, central services that are involved in student recruitment are also the ones that offer information and guidance services to students. Again, an interesting example from Finland. Timo, you will be very happy to hear that. So in Finland, personal study planning exists at all Finnish universities to guide students through their studies and help them choose between learning pathways. A personal study plan can be designed by a student and their advisor to meet students' interests, objective, and study options. A personal study plan is an electronic document that outlines the study progress of students, time to complete a degree, and different ways to complete it. The personal study plans are a good practice at the level of the case higher education institutions. That was an applied university and a university, and they help students through their study and career options. So every student is assigned a study advisor, and students can benefit from discussions with the advisor during their bachelor's or master's studies. The personal study plans have been also important for realizing the possibilities for cross studies at the universities and applied universities in Finland. So cross studies enlarge the curricular choices of students as they can take courses from different institutions. But to do that, students need guidance to understand what courses are available and would best suit their particular pathway. So this makes the personal study plans even more necessary. So I come to my last slide, and I have been a little bit long, even if I have cut my presentation. So to conclude, currently we can observe that new ways of learning and acquiring skills already engage millions of learners worldwide. And flexible learning can empower students by offering them choices in the pace, place, and mode of delivery. It can be, however, challenging to provide flexible learning that is economically viable and appropriately managed for students and higher education institutions. So for that, we see the following action points. Diverse entry pathways support the policy objective to improve availability and accessibility of higher education, but they still often do so for the smaller number of learners. Successful flexible entry instruments need both national policies, funding, and institutional investment. Recognition is, of course, a crucial aspect of flexible admission policies. More effort needs to be paid to the recognition of informal and non-formal learning in particular. Offering more flexible higher education in terms of delivery and pacing is unavoidable because COVID-19 has forced higher education systems to operate under these modalities. Open, online, and distance learning has become the main mode of delivery and learning during COVID-19 pandemic. But to be fully recognized and quality assured, it requires quality standards. The implementation of quality ODL programs require a balance of student-centered, institutional, and national approaches. And then finally, transfer policies are great for facilitating flexibility during studies, as they open opportunities for learners for the reorientation and therefore increase chances to succeed in higher education. To ensure transfer policies function well, there's a need for well-functioning credit systems with well-elaborated learning outcomes, as well as the development of study programs with broad curricular options, in particular policies, in particular at the early study stage of learners. Such flexibility encourages learners to shape the study pathways according to the student needs. So to conclude, for the above policies to work, there is need for a coordinated approach between government policies, quality assurance agencies, and higher education institutions that address not only available resources, but also a broader vision of what flexibility of learning can provide. So I want to stop here, and I'm available for your question, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela. It was a very thorough presentation on the different perspectives, and I think you paved the way for the whole week to discuss further on this, like more macro level, meso level, and micro level questions. I have some questions in my mind, but I saw that in the chat there were a couple of questions, at least from Christina. So maybe we could have those first. So Christina, actually you had many questions. So would you like to speak up and share the most important on your mind at the moment, please?
Hello, Timo. Yeah, sorry, I had quite a lot of questions, but it was so interesting that I couldn't stop thinking about all these aspects you delivered. So thank you for this excellent introduction and for this week. Okay, maybe, I don't know if these questions are all interesting for all the people, but maybe is the first is the ISKE level equivalent with the EQF? Then you mentioned that a lot of high institutions offer more short cycle programs in terms of micro credentials. Then I also mentioned that you mentioned the centers in Chile in the rural areas who offer RPL. I have an example of Iceland, where they also have centers where they offer RPL in rural areas, which I think is very interesting. And the third question I had is the CAT limited by legal regulations. And personally, I would like to see such a personal study plan example from Finland. So hope this is not too much. Sorry, Timo.
No problem. Michaela, which one shall you choose to start from?
Yeah, I will try to go by order and hope to respond as comprehensively as possible. So the relationship between ISKET and the European Qualifications Framework, I think that's it, isn't it, Christina? That's what you want to know. I think there is no formal alignment, but de facto, I think there's a lot of similarity, because the ISKET in higher education is quite complex, of course. And ISKET, there's higher education formally starts with ISKET 5, which is short cycle, which is the short cycle higher education, so 2 years program after secondary education. And I think that's also a level on the EQF, if I'm not mistaken. Then the next one is the ISKET 6, which is the bachelor's level. This is another level on the EQF. And then the next one is ISKET 7, which is master's. And the next one is doctorate. So I think there is, I think there is a de facto alignment there, but I'm not sure whether it is legally or formally aligned. But the more complex one is the ISKET 4. The ISKET 4 is, I mean, in the British context, I think these are diploma programs, 1-year programs. In some countries, they are part of upper secondary education. In some others, they are not. So here we have a gray zone a little bit. But I would say when it comes ISCET 5 to ISCET 8, we are quite well aligned with the European Qualifications Framework. I think then there was the comment of the good example in Ireland of RPL Center, Iceland, in the rural areas. So I think that is really an important practice because I mean what we have also seen in our study is that recognition of prior learning is not, I mean, formally targeting disadvantaged youth, but these are typically people who did not get a chance for one reason or the other to enter into higher education. And so we all know how important it is not to create dead ends in education systems. That it is always possible if later on you want to continue your studies, that there is a possibility. And then if you went through a vocational or professional road, that this learning can be recognized. So but still, I mean, I think that what we have seen as the big challenge in recognition of prior learning, and I think it raises an interesting question, is really the difficulties to recognize non-formal and informal learning. And while everything that formal learning, prior formal learning can be recognized relatively easily, but when it comes to work-based learning and obtaining recognition for that, or when it comes to informal learning, not even work-based learning, but somebody maybe who has worked in an association, has done some charity work, to get recognition for that, that I think is the big challenge at this point in time. So the location of the centers is one important aspect, but the types of learning that are recognized, that is another big challenge, remains a challenge. And I think you asked a third question that I didn't quite well understand. Can you repeat it, perhaps?
No, actually it's fine. I just want to mention something because we are just doing a big project on non-informal learning validation. And there are so many really excellent examples when it comes to informal learning by institution, adult learning institution, even for pathfinders, the scouts, they have developed tools for recognition of informal and non-formal learning. Actually, it's just on us as a higher institution, we have to use these tools and we have to implement it in our institution. Although they're not from high institutions, but they're very good standardized and they're excellent in their methods. So actually they're existing. There's no problem. We just should use them. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Okay. That's very encouraging to see that the instruments are there, but then maybe the question is, I mean, how can we get them more broadly used?
Mm-hmm. True.
You just have to go to the validation festival. There's a big validation festival every year, and then there are the people from the other educators, and you just go there and use them. So sorry.
No, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but like Christina was suggesting, there is the element of not invented here. So when it's designed and developed in another sector at the education system, so for some reason we feel that this is not for us and this is so complicated or something. But next question comes from Eva, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Timo, and thank you, Michaela, for the very, very interesting overview also on the survey that you did. And actually, I'm interested in the idea of individual curricula or forms of negotiated learning, because what I can see, well, a bit in Germany, when it comes to continuing education, that, we think about smaller modules, and then you could think of making more and more, and maybe at some point having a formal degree. And I see also for quite some time in the UK, for example, forms of negotiated learning where it's also about work-based learning partly. And so I was just wondering if you had some insights on that within your study, or if you would like to share something of this, because I saw also UK, and then I thought, well, there are some examples doing that, but maybe there are not so many. So I would be thankful for some insights from you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's one, of course, that relates to this broader topic of flexibility, because I think in a way, you know, and it's a little bit discussable. This is not there's no consensus on this. This is an area of discussion. I mean, how broad should the curriculum be actually at the beginning? So there are different opinions, and there are different disciplinary understandings around this. And so, I mean, we know all that in the sciences. I think the knowledge and I think also the teaching is maybe much more constructed than it is in the social science and in the humanities. And so the idea, I mean, something that emerged quite strongly from our research was that it was easier, for instance, to allow for transfers later on, when at the beginning, the curriculum was relatively broad. When it was really specialized at the beginning, it was much more difficult than rather later on to allow a student to move into something quite different. That sounds, of course, quite intuitive, but in a way, it's not something which is, I mean, what I think the way that curriculum construction has gone in the, I think over the past decades, I mean, we come from a tradition of liberal arts very much, but then it became all very much specialized later on, because under the imperative of preparing students for the labor market and to have really specified competencies that match with particular professions, it became much more specialized. So, but there are still some pockets in universities of these broad-based curricula, and I think we identified them as a good example. Now, I think your point, Eva, about negotiated curriculum, I think what the way, I'm not sure whether I understand you fully, but the way I interpreted it is that it's more choice for the student. Is that what it means? So
yeah, it's actually an individually negotiated program, and okay, probably even the way how the degree is called, or the specification of the degree, which you find in some UK universities. And I think it's interesting, just if we think about flexibility, because it's, yeah, if you want to say, it's a radical move. So
I think it's very radical, but it is very, so what we have seen is where that was quite prominent and was actually in the Finnish system. And it was underpinned, and I thought that was really interesting. It was, so the student was not left alone with this, but the student could actually get guidance and could get, you know, discussion with an advisor, because a student can be also feel totally overburdened, you know, with too much choice and not knowing where to go. So sometimes students feel more at ease if they are a little bit guided, but that takes away the flexibility. So I think if one broadly opens up, you know, these negotiated learning, then I think it's very important to have a very good guidance system. There are not so many students who know exactly what they want. There are still many students who still try to find their way going through higher education, and then, you know, once even they change, they want to they have new ideas they want to change. So it's really, I mean, I think it remains a complex issue.
True, very good. And maybe to add a little bit on that, you mentioned that in the beginning of the studies, there should be more freedom or flexibility there, and that was exactly what happened in Finland when there was the last kind of like development of the curricula, that we saw that it doesn't make sense to start studying, for example, sociology the first day at the university and just focus on that, but to start more broadly on social sciences in the beginning, And if people see that this was actually not a good choice for me, so they can still move on in the same sphere of social sciences to another topic area where they feel more fit, and then they specialize later on.
Yeah.
And by doing this is much more helpful also for the recognition of studies, that there's in the beginning, there's a more broader view for the.
But what I found so interesting in the Finnish example was this cross studies, that I haven't seen that in any higher education system so far, that a student can take a credit from another higher education institution. Maybe they have a particular interest in, I don't know now, in something really specific. And this is offered only in one or two other higher education institutions. They can do it and they can integrate it into, they can gain recognition for that. But that, I think, that requires also quite a strong steering of the higher education sector to make this possible, because this is something very interesting that we have seen also. We have, I mean, most higher education systems and institutions themselves find themselves in a tension between governmental steering and the market. They want to attract students and they want to attract funders, and they are in competition with each other. So what brings them to collaborate? That is a very interesting question. And this cross study is not something that happens by itself. It happens only if this is organized, I think, for the whole system, or maybe also that, let's say, all higher education institutions collectively decide to agree on this, which is hardly ever the case.
Exactly, yeah.
So what you can see in most systems is that you have a kind of an elite group of higher education institutions working among themselves, exchanging students, having agreements among themselves, and you have a second layer and you have a third layer. I think it's a little bit a pity that this happens, because the student wants to have access to as many opportunities as possible. So to have to go within these different layers of institutions, I think, is again a limitation. And that is, unfortunately, sometimes it's the market that does that.
True. And like you said in your presentation, so there's need for more and more good guidance on how to navigate in this rather complex system. But before we end today's discussion, there's still one more question from Clara. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Clara Engelsterini. I'm from the European Commission. Until very recently, I used to work in the higher education unit now, and working on topics of quality assurance, credits, Bologna process, and especially micro-credentials. And now I'm moved within the Commission to the Director General dealing with employment skills. And there I'm responsible for adult learning policy. So this is how I'm joining your event, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And connecting to what Michaela just said, I think there is a very, very interesting development now with the European Universities Alliances, which are asked to work in such a way that they can seamlessly integrate each other's credits into their programs. And these networks of universities are sometimes really big. So I think now on average 6 universities are members in one alliance, but the intention is to broaden it a little bit more, and already close to 200 universities in Europe are part of it. So hopefully this will give some boost to this, because I think this is already a massive number of universities which are really working on it, and I think this is a challenge for them, and it's also a challenge for them to offer programs which are also for adult learners, or for lifelong learners for continuous development, especially because of the difficulties with finances. And if you have a German university where it is more or less all market based, what they offer to adults, while in Finland it's all free, then that's more or less, I might simplify things, but these are challenges which are now being raised to the level of the ministries, because they want to cooperate, and these are challenges they have to solve somehow to be able to do what they offered in their grant application. So I think there is hope for improvement here, at least in Europe, and very soon, in a few weeks' time, there will still in December there will be a proposal by the Commission on micro credentials, and also on the individual learning accounts, which tackles a little bit the part of the financing issues, but from the perspective of the individual. So this will be hopefully also a good basis for further work at national level and for further discussion. And thank you very much again for your very interesting presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Michaela, and thank you for the. Yeah,
it was good to know, Clara, to update us on on these European initiatives. I think they are extremely important. I have followed and watched. I was also part of the consultation on the micro credentials, which I think is a great initiative, and I think for me it's the way forward for higher education. Flexibilizing. It doesn't mean that every initial student has to go through a micro-credential scheme. It comes as something supplementary, but as a great opportunity, I think, for learners to accumulate knowledge and to use it in such a way that it becomes a stackable scheme and that they can obtain a qualification. So I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it adds also to the need of more modular contents that can be consumed easily. So Clara, thank you for that update too. I have just one very short last question for you, Michael, for tomorrow, as we are talking about management. So regarding the survey you have done and the study, so do you have any feedback for the managers that how should they now proceed to add flexibilization to higher education? Do you have some ideas or wishes for the managers?
I would say number one, exploit the policies which are there, So, I mean, it's for me, it's natural, but, I'm a systems thinker. And so I think it's important that, those policies which are there to implement them. And I would say also everything that, I mean, they're also what we have seen in our survey as well is, the taking of initiatives in the higher education sector. And that depends, of course, also on how systems are run. For instance, in Chile, in Latin America, universities are very autonomous. So they take a lot of initiative. And they organize among themselves. So I think that is also this taking of initiative towards more flexibility in the interest of students. I think that is also something which is important. Huh? Yeah, and then management is a complex thing. It's how you fit into legal frameworks, how you work within financial constraints, how you work with political constraints. So it's a complex area, but I think it's quite it's an interesting one as well. And I think flexibility is the future. So yeah, so it will be interesting to see what you come up with.
That's true. So thank you so much for your time and the presentation. I think from the whole group here, we were very happy to hear your thoughts. Mm-hmm. And tomorrow we will continue with the management perspective at 3 o'clock Central European time. So I hope you will be there with a big crowd. Thank you so much.
Okay. It was a pleasure. Wishing you all the best for the event. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.